Welcome to The Workplace, a podcast by CalChamber. I'm Matthew Roberts, Associate General Counsel for Labor and Employment with the California Chamber of Commerce. Hello, listeners. As you're all no doubt aware, the Los Angeles region is dealing with an unprecedented wildfire disaster, and everyone here at CalChamber mourns the loss of life and property in the region thus far. At CalChamber, we understand that the surprising and shocking scale of this disaster has left many employers with questions about how to address many of the issues that have since popped up. And to discuss these issues that employers must consider and account for, we welcome back CalChamber's General Counsel of Labor and Employment, Bianca Saad. Welcome back to the show, Bianca.
Thank you, Matt. Happy to be here. Wish it was under better circumstances.
Yeah, ditto. Absolutely unbelievable what we've seen over the last week or so there. Of course, the immediate impact of wildfires in any region, not just Los Angeles, but as we know, wildfires are just something that are prevalent here in the state. Besides the actual path of the fire itself is that smoke that the wildfires will release. With so many employers with outdoor workers or workers who may spend some of their time outdoors or just workspaces that are open to the outdoor air, they may be impacted by the smoke of those fires. So Bianca, what do employers need to do to minimize this danger and risk for the health and safety of its employees?
Great question. Well, first, employers whose workplaces may be affected by air quality should be aware of current outdoor smoke regulations. Now, there are some exceptions, and so that includes where workers are working in a completely enclosed building or vehicle with mechanical ventilation, and windows and doors are kept shut except to enter and exit that building or vehicle. Can also include where the worker is exposed to wildfire smoke for a cumulative period of time that's shorter than 1 hour during their shift, or if the worker is a firefighter who is fighting the wildfire. Now, outside of those exceptions, though, the regulation is broad enough to cover work sites that may feel like they are indoors, but because the doors are consistently open, like in retail establishments, many are still going to be covered. So for those employers who are covered by this regulation, they must monitor the air quality index, or AQI, for levels of a particulate matter called PM 2.5. And when the level rises to 151 or higher, they must take engineering and administrative efforts to reduce exposure. For example, they can do this by moving the workers inside a filtered building or moving them to another outdoor location where the AQI for PM 2.5 is lower than 150. Employers must also offer for voluntary use respirators such as N95s. Now, when the AQI reaches over 500 for PM 2.5, then that respirator use is going to be mandatory. And prior to its use, employers must undergo regular standards to ensure the proper fit, and they must ensure that the worker's health is such that they can wear a respirator while working.
Okay. And I know employers will have questions about, how do I figure out this AQI index, of course. And I know from my perspective, there's some government websites that you can utilize, the most common of which is the EPA's Air Now smoke and wildfire map. That's a great resource that'll show you what the air quality is in your region and your specific location where employees may be working. There's other government websites that you may use as well. Now, this regulation is a key point to keep in mind, this wildfire smoke regulation, as California continues just to experience regular wildfire disasters, that this is something that's permanent, right, Bianca? It's not just an emergency regulation specific to this wildfire.
That's right.
Okay. So then that's really the first role, right, is protecting the safety and well-being of our employees. And in some cases, that might mean actually just shutting down or reducing operations. I know you talked about some administrative controls like moving employees from one outdoor area to another, and that just might mean, well, we just can't have them in that outdoor area. So that raises some significant questions about how we pay these affected or impacted employees. So Bianca, how generally do wage and hour laws impact an employer's response to wildfires?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And the answer to this is going to depend on whether we're talking about a non-exempt or an hourly employee or an exempt employee. So for our non-exempt employees, we pay them only for the hours actually worked. So if you're unable to put a non-exempt employee to work, then you generally do not have to pay them. Now, we do have California's reporting time pay rule that says if we fail to put them to work on an already scheduled shift, or they're given less than half the hours they were scheduled, we need to pay half their shift, and that can be up to 4 hours total paid at their regular rate of compensation. There are exceptions to this rule, though, and one of those includes if the reason that the work is unavailable is due to acts of God, such as wildfires, or recommendations from a civil authority to cease operations. So in those situations, the reporting time pay rule doesn't apply. Now, additionally, California doesn't have any statewide predictable scheduling law, so this does give employers the ability to eliminate shifts or modify their future schedules at will without any specific amount of notice. There are some industry-specific predictive scheduling ordinances, including within the LA city limits. However, these ordinances don't apply when operations are impacted under circumstances such as these. So that's for our non-exempt employees. Now let's switch to our exempt employees. So the general rule for our exempt employees is that if they perform any work in a work week, they're ready, willing, and able to perform that work throughout the week, they will be paid their entire salary, even if the reason they are not being put to work for the entire week is due to an employer's closing operations due to the wildfires. Now, if operations remain shut for an entire work week and that exempt employee performs absolutely no work during that week, even if they are ready, willing, and able, then in that situation, an employer can deduct that week's salary. So whether we're talking about an exempt employee or a non-exempt employee, if an employee is experiencing lost wages resulting from the wildfires, then they do have the ability to file a claim with the California Employment Development Department, better known as the EDD. And they can, file that claim. And, us as employers, we can provide that information to our employees so that they can do so.
Yeah, an interesting thing to note with that unemployment claim as well that you've talked about is that during periods of emergency such as this, the waiting time period that we're familiar with for unemployment benefits is waived. So any employees who have experienced even just the last week and a half that we've been talking about here, any lost wages there, they can file back to that date and start receiving benefits as long as they're eligible, of course. So in addition to unemployment claims to kind of help make up some of the lost wages that have happened as a result of the wildfire, employees also have time off balances that they may wish to use to supplement this lost income. So how does their paid time off work during wildfires, Bianca?
Yep. So like with the lost wages, again, it's going to depend on what is the form of paid time off that we're talking about. So is it vacation, or are we talking about, California's mandatory paid sick leave? So let's take pure vacation banks first. And the answer to this is really going to be based on what is the employer's policies and practices around vacation. One thing that we do need to ensure is that we are enforcing that policy uniformly. So in other words, if we are going to deny vacation use for wildfires to one employee, then we should be doing so across the board for any employees under similar circumstances. Now, if we're talking about paid sick leave, that is a different story because, as we know, that's governed strictly by California law, and we have, strict requirements around that. So first, relevant point for this discussion is that we just had a clarifying law that took effect January 1st of this year, expressly allowing agricultural workers to use their paid sick leave bank when their work sites are closed during emergency proclamations related to wildfires, heat, or flooding. But even beyond that, paid sick leave allows use for any circumstance where the employee is taking the time off to prevent an injury or illness for themselves or for a qualifying family member, as well as to treat and recover from an existing injury or illness. So wildfire conditions can, of course, lead to or exacerbate medical conditions, which means paid sick leave usage could be appropriate during closures to protect the health of the employee or a qualifying family member. And then lastly, some schools and licensed daycare centers have closed or may close during future wildfire conditions. So if an employee has a child in a school or a daycare that has closed unexpectedly, that employee may utilize up to 40 hours of job-protected school activities leave. This leave is available if the employee works at a work site with 25 or more employees and the time off is unpaid.
Bianca, you and I know as veterans of discussing paid sick leave and time off in the various webinars and seminars that we've done, a lot of employers in California have one size fits all banks, right? Where they combine their vacation and their paid sick leave together. And I know we've talked about this rule quite a bit, but I think it'd behoove everybody to hear it. So how do we address that? Vacations at our discretion, PSL is, governed by California law, but we just have one bank that governs all of it.
Yeah, so that question really illustrates one of the challenges with having that one size fits all bank, because we know that we have these minimum paid sick leave requirements, for example, that we must provide, where it's, at the employee's discretion, it's protected time, we can't deny it. How are you demonstrating that you provided that minimum amount of paid sick leave under those protected conditions versus just your additional vacation time that is above and beyond? And so it's really something, now is a great time for those employers that have one to really kind of look at that and ask themselves those questions. If they don't have, good answers and a way to establish that, then that may be an indication to revisit that policy.
Yeah, excellent. As always, lots of considerations around that. Now, one last major issue that I know I'm hearing from members in general is just how do we handle any kind of notifications of closures or resumptions in operations, or just what our future plans might be as they pertain to the wildfires. So first, Bianca, are there any required notices that employers must provide to their employees? And then just some general thoughts about how we communicate during natural disasters like this.
Sure. So there's no general notice that is required in these circumstances to employees across the board. However, there are some specific communication requirements and practices, again, that we want to be aware of. So, for example, we talked about those wildfire smoke rules. So, of course, employers who are covered by that do need to communicate those rules to their employees when conditions warrant, letting them know, again, what's happening if they're changing administrative controls and, engaging in those efforts to meet their requirements for those. Now, there is another requirement that's related to a recent amendment that we saw to California's Labor Code Section 2810.5, notice to employee. This is also sometimes referred to as the wage theft notice. So this is that notice that is given to our non-exempt employees upon hire. And as of last year, the form does require employers to notify employees of a state or a federal emergency proclamation in their county that may impact the health and safety of that new hire. So employers only have to provide this notice to the new hires whose health and safety may be impacted for those emergencies declared within 30 days of their hire. So, for example, with the example at hand, on January 7th, Governor Newsom issued an emergency proclamation for Los Angeles and Ventura counties. So that means that any new hires within 30 days of January 7th will need to be notified of the emergency on their wage theft notice. And again, the question is, could that potentially impact the health and safety of the new hire? And then lastly, even if that specific notice isn't required, and, we talked about the fact there isn't any general notice that's required under these circumstances, but we, of course, want to have open and prompt communications with our employees to help, ensure operations are remaining stable. For those of us who have had to close, keeping that open line of communication is going to help us when it's time to resume, once we are able to resume operations, just to bring everybody back and keep everybody informed.
Excellent. I think that's a really good point there at the end for employers, especially as we're kind of into the new year and we're refreshing and looking over our policies and procedures just in general, that we do need to be prepared for emergencies, just generally, whether it's wildfire, it's flooding, weather-related, some other kind of threats that may be impacting property or life. And so if you don't have robust emergency response procedures or communication efforts like Bianca's talked about here, it's probably a good idea to kind of figure out how would we do that, right? If we all of a sudden have to evacuate our buildings because of a natural disaster, how would we communicate everything to our employees? And so I think that's a great reminder. Now, Bianca, we've discussed a lot of issues that employers must consider here in this episode. Do you have any suggestions for additional resources for employers?
Yes. So in fact, CalChamber has put together a resource page that has dozens of links of resources that may be useful for businesses that are impacted by the wildfires. And the great thing about that is, anybody can access this page. It's open to the public, not limited to our members.
Well, Bianca, thank you so much for taking some time to discuss these recent issues with me and joining me here today on the show.
It was my pleasure, Matt. Thanks again for having me.
And again, we hope everyone impacted by the wildfires remains safe and that the resources provided today will assist in that recovery however they might do so. So thank you, listeners, again for joining this discussion on the workplace. Please share and subscribe to CalChamber's podcast by visiting calchamber.com.